Okay, welcome to Community Call. If you have any, I see some items in the agenda, but if you have any additional ones, drop them in there. Otherwise, we'll take a look at the backlog after we've got through what's in this agenda, if there's time. So first on the list is Phil Brooks for OCM-less multi-cluster DNS. So just to give a sort of brief introduction there, what that means. So we're using OCM at the moment to do multi-cluster DNS in order to sort of see the gateways. However, having to use OCM presents quite a barrier to adoption, and it's a system that you need to learn with a whole set of its own APIs. So we wanted to see what was possible with multi-cluster DNS without OCM, so without like a hub cluster. So with that in mind, I'll hand it over to Phil if he's here.
Hey, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool, I'll just share my screen quickly. Okay, I'm assuming you can see that. So yeah, so I put together a POC of a solution that I had in mind for this OCM-less DNS controller, and I just wanted to walk you all through it to get your feedback if you've got any thoughts on how it might be implemented in a more sort of actual manner. So I'll just talk quickly about the setup that I've got here. I've got two clusters. At the top is cluster 1, let's say, and at the bottom, these bottom 2 are cluster 2. I'm going to be running the controller locally against each of them in these windows on the left and the cube commands here on the right. At the moment, both of these workload clusters have got a gateway on them, an Istio gateway, and that gateway has got a route attached to it and like a bit of an echo service thing sort of sitting behind it. I don't have the TLS controller running, so I won't be able to do a curl. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to get that switch back on, but nevertheless, we'll be able to see the DNS anyway. So each of those also has a managed zone put in them, which is pointing to this zone file in route 53, which, as you can see, has got nothing in it at the moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start up the controller on cluster 1. And we'll see that that will find the gateway and see that it has an attached. Sorry, I'll see. Craig, you've got a question?
I was just going to ask, are there any policies in place yet, or is it just a gateway, a HTTP route, and like an echo service in each?
Oh yeah, okay. So there is a DNS policy in place. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a fairly standard DNS policy. It's nothing particularly clever. It's just pointing. It's just so that the managed zone can be found and point to the route 53.
Okay. Maybe show us it when you get a chance.
Okay. So this is basically functioning as we kind of expect in a single cluster setup right now, where the gateway has been found, a DNS record has been put together, and that should have been published by now. And we can see it's got the IP address put in here. So that's one cluster, right? And that's not all that different to what we're used to currently. So now what I'm going to do is in the second cluster, I'm going to start exactly the same controller. I'm passing in this cluster ID. This is a new field, and I have to change the ports because it's all running on my Mac. But otherwise, it's basically the exact same thing running on the second cluster. So the key thing about this is that neither of these controllers are communicating with each other or are even aware of each other's existence, but they are both collaborating on the DNS records in the same zone file without destroying each other's records. At least that's the hope. So once this comes up now, what I'm expecting to see over here is a second A record for cluster 2 and a second entry in this default geo that points to that cluster 2 A record. Just waiting for that to get started. Okay, So if we reload that now, so we can see the second one has been introduced here. So now the workload is DNS load balanced across both of those clusters without either of them knowing about each other. So then the next thing that I'm going to do to try and simulate an IP address of one of these clusters changing is I'm going to change the IP address in the zone, and then we'll see that the cluster will correct its own IP address. So if I change that to say 203, so that's cluster 1 that we've just updated, and actually it's just shut off there already, so it should already be fixed. Yeah, that's already fixed itself back there. So then the other thing that I just quickly want to show is in the same scenario, if I stop the controller on cluster 1 and change cluster 1's IP address again, and we'll just wait for, oh yeah, there's cluster 2 is just reconciled. So we should see here that that doesn't get fixed because cluster 2 has got no idea about cluster 1 and what its settings should be. So it's completely ignoring values that it doesn't know what it's supposed to be doing with. So that's effectively the end of the sort of technical demo. In terms of the POC, what's missing, the sort of big gap, I guess, evident gap here is that I haven't got cleanup in this POC yet. So that would be done, I imagine, through a finalizer on the DNS policy that would clean up as the DNS policy was deleted. It would clean up its own records out of the zone file. And then the idea is that at the end of the DNS record reconcile, there would be a sanity check to go back through the DNS records and check that everything that's about to be published can be resolved, that there isn't, for example, if my cluster has removed this cluster 1, it would need to sort of go up and check that this CNAME to cluster 1 is removed, and then if that was the last one, then this CNAME to that CNAME would need to be removed, and so on, kind of up. So whenever the last one comes out of this, it would also remove all of the sort of dead end DNS records that are there. So I can pause there. I've got a little further to go, but if there's any questions at that point of the technical implementation, now might be a good time. Guy?
Yeah, thanks. So Phil, you mentioned that each controller running into one of the clusters, they are not tapping on each other's toes, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's any synchronization between them, right? And effectively, what we see here is that each controller seems to be taking care of its own record. Is there any kind of synchronization between them? How one controller makes sure that it's not overwriting what the other one did? So maybe you can dig a little deeper on the details of that.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a good point. I did mean to go into that. So the change that I've made here is each reconciler, at each DNS policy reconciler, at the beginning of its reconcile loop, will do a list from route 53 and pull down everything that's in the DNS record, and then sort of assemble back to front to a DNS record CR from what it got out of route 53. Then when it goes to author the DNS record to make sure that it is the way it wants it to be, rather than just writing it from scratch, what it will do is go into the existing DNS record that's just been updated, the DNS record CR, take out any values that reference itself. So cluster 1, for example, would see its own ID in this A record, so remove that, and then also see that the value of this one is itself and remove that. Then it would but leave all the other clusters, anything that isn't its own, leave them all in place. Then rebuild everything that it needs from the top down, all the way from the host down to its own A record, rebuild them, inject everything that isn't duplicating back into the DNS record, and then send all that back. So all it will ever do is change its own values. Whatever is currently there that it doesn't recognize, it will leave, and just make sure that the full trail from host all the way down to its IP address exists in the DNS record. Cool. Craig?
Yeah, can you go in a bit deeper into the shared records and what happens there?
Yeah, so for example, like this default LB, is this a sort of what you mean?
Yeah, like there's some like so pb.hcp apps or my app, sorry, .pb.hcpapps.net is shared, and then lb hyphen is shared, right? What happens with those records?
Yeah, so these ones, the manner that they're generated, these hashes, is the same based on the managed zone. So those values are always the same. So each controller will just ensure that those records exist, because they're the same for all of them. And if they're not present, then they will be created. But if they are present, then they're just ignored and left the way they are, assuming the values all match. Where with ones that the controller wants to have itself in as a target of potentially multiple targets, it will create the record that it wants to create. So in this case, the default CNAME to my own cluster, it will create that. But then when it goes to add that to the DNS record, it will first scan to see if it's already there. And if it's already there and doesn't have the target that it's wanting to add, then it will append the target to the list of targets. Because these CNAMEs, you can't have, in the DNS record CR, you can't have a CNAME like this twice. Do you know what I mean? There have to be two targets in one endpoint, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So the shared default has to have a unique target of my cluster. Is that
exactly? Yeah. So it will look to see, is the entire endpoint absent, and if so, it will add it. If the endpoint isn't absent, then it will check that the target that it requires is present in the target.
Okay, and because the construction of the DNS record names is consistent across clusters, the shared records end up being the same across clusters, no matter what.
Yeah, the main change to the format of the DNS records that I've made in this POC, which is obviously up for discussion, is just this adding in of a tag so that any given controller can find its own records again.
I'll let you go now.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe we can step back a little bit and you can elaborate a little bit more on why we want such functionality without OCM in the first place, and what kind of things we would be giving up upon in such case.
Okay, maybe I can take that one because I actually tasked Phil with looking into this. So there's two main reasons why we wanted to look at this. One, the first reason I kind of mentioned in the intro, having to use OCM introduces quite a lot of complexity for what might be like a small number of clusters that you're looking to share DNS and ingress across. So if you've only got two clusters, like introducing OCM for that is like quite a bit of overhead and a whole new stack that you have to learn. So yeah, barrier to entry is the first one. The second one is for simplicity of migration from single cluster to multi-cluster. Because with this setup, you can go from a single cluster like without OCM, with just Kuadrant installed with a DNS policy, and effectively mirror that setup into another cluster and then into another cluster. And so you should, in theory, be able to move from single to multi-cluster without really having to take on the overhead of learning anything particularly, like anything really new there. You're just redeploying and creating a new cluster ID for the controller. As far as what we're losing, there's a couple of things I suppose we're losing. One is that we don't have the redundancy of the hub. So if a cluster just gets nuked, those records are probably going to hang around until something intervenes. And that may be something that we can mitigate in some way. We had an idea of effectively adding a TXT record with a timestamp value for when a controller last registered with the zone, and then basically having like a deadlock system, right, where
I actually have a bit more information I can share on that next if you want to get into that now, unless we want to go to Alex's question.
Yeah, I just wanted to go through like what we're losing.
Sorry.
And to a certain effect, certain level, we're losing like a single definition of the gateway as a resource in a cluster, because now you're going to have multiple gateways deployed to multiple clusters. I don't necessarily see that as a drawback, but it is something that you're losing. They're the main ones I can think of, Guy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That all makes sense to me. I wonder, sorry, before handing over to Alex, any implications to the other kind of policies that we have? I'm thinking on the use case of the same way that we used to replicate a gateway definition across multiple classes for the other policies, like all policy, rate limit policy that we. I know that the main use case is, or at least the workflow that we have nowadays is of creating each one of those policies in each one of the small clusters. But because we had OCM, we also had all the machinery if we wanted to define that once in the control plane and get them replicated across the rest of the network, right? Whereas now, I imagine that would not be covered anymore.
So in a document that I put together before the break, I had, Alex, we're coming to you, sorry. I had 3 steps of evolution outlined, where you went from single cluster to small multi-cluster without OCM to, I guess, what I would call like massively multi-cluster with OCM. So the way that this is designed, it should work in a single cluster the same way it would work in an OCM hub, because it's effectively looking at one instance of a gateway with multiple addresses. And then the only real difference is when you deploy it to multiple clusters, you just need to give it a different cluster ID for each cluster, and then it will work in the same way again. Because it's now that those addresses are spread across 2 clusters, if that makes sense. So with the way that we're trying to design this, the code shouldn't be too divergent throughout the environments, and we should be able to still support an OCM-based deployment. Alex?
Yeah, I'm maybe asking a question that was sort of indirectly answered. Let's be honest, I probably didn't pay good attention at the very beginning. But like, what do I have to do to go from the single to the multi-cluster use case in this case? I guess, and fundamentally, my question is about the interaction of DLB one, the CNAME with the geolocalization, and how do we ever thought of even make that strategy pluggable?
Yeah, that was kind of a part of the demo, which maybe I didn't point out or make clear enough, was initially I went from just cluster 1 with only its A record in the default geo. And then once we saw that published, started the controller on cluster 2 with the same managed zone, and it introduced its own IP address into that geo to be part of the kind of low balance workload. If that makes sense.
Okay, because it sees it was like somebody was already there effectively.
Yeah, so in terms of introducing a new cluster, it's a matter of putting the right CRs into that cluster and then running the controller.
Sorry to interject, but it sounds like that it's each cluster is kind of self-onboarding, right? As opposed to from a control plane, you have all which is the only place where you store the credentials with the DNS cloud service. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of phrasing it. Yeah.
And so what happens in the other case? If I go from multi to single, like then that indirection sticks, or when it sees that it's the only one left, it goes back to
So as each cluster comes out, I haven't covered tidy up in the proof of concept, but as each cluster deletes the DNS policy, the finalizer there should have it go and remove all of its records from the zone. And if you get all the way down to the last cluster, then there'd just be the one A record. If that DNS policy then gets deleted as well, that last one as it's coming out will clean up behind it and remove the dead ends.
All right, cool. Yeah, and sorry again if that was covered. My bad. I must admit,
problem.
I missed part of the beginning.
Peter?
Yeah, so my question is, do we basically now are introducing another configuration? Like we can run everything on single cluster, we can run everything on OCM multi-cluster, and now we should run almost everything on no OCM multi-cluster.
So the configuration is the same configuration as a single cluster. It just has to be present on all of the clusters because there is no OCM hub for it.
Oh, yeah. The reason why I'm asking is what I more meant. Sorry, I should have clarified better. Test configuration, basically, right? We support if people can or customers, users can run it either multi-cluster, or they can use multi-cluster without OCM, or they can use multi-cluster with OCM. So those are not those are going to be the three main supported configurations, or how do you want to call it?
Yeah, I actually in the like second half of this, I can go into the different sort of flavors of it in a little bit more detail. So maybe that might clarify it for you then.
Peter, you're correct. Right, there'll be three configurations.
Okay, it's not problem now. I'm still gonna raise it because we are getting configurations more quicker than not, and I'm worrying about configuration explosion in the near future. We will of course manage it somehow, but yeah, just wanted to raise that. It is a risk.
It's fair. It's fair, and like maybe at some point we drop OCM if we feel like there's actually not the use case for that massively multi-cluster setup. It depends on what the use cases are from customers and end users, right? Like if they have 50 clusters that have ingress gateways that they want to manage, then maybe they want to use ACM. If they've got 3, maybe they don't, right? But yeah, there is 3 configurations, as in there's 2 multi-cluster configurations and 1 single cluster configuration. This isn't landed in main, by the way. This is just a POC at this stage. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can have a discussion about testing it and how we want to proceed once it's
absolutely
close to emerging. Yeah. Thank you.
Dee?
I think my question kind of was more or less answered already by Craig when you were listing the things that we lose. But anyway, I'm going to ask it anyway. I wonder what happens if one of the clusters becomes unresponsive, right? If it crashes for any reason. And I was wondering if it would make sense, even for the simplest scenario here, to implement some kind of distributed health check system across the clusters, so they keep on checking if the other ones are live and running.
So yeah, okay. I think now is a good time for me to, maybe I should have just done this all at once, but in any case, I'll move on to this sort of second half where I've got some information on some thoughts I've had around that, and then we can have a chat after that maybe. So here what I've done is I've tried to lay out the 3 different flavors that I see for this DNS controller, the sort of updated DNS controller.
Can you zoom in a bit, Phil? That's
sorry. Yeah. Yes. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So this first one here on the left is a single cluster, so it's obviously the most simple. It's got the gateway with host names and some IP addresses. And then based on the DNS policy, just like currently, it will create some DNS health checks that will ping its own endpoints to see if it thinks they're healthy or not. And then use those health checks as a gateway to determine whether or not the IP address should go into the DNS record or not. That's really extremely similar to what we're doing already. It's just in this slightly rejigged logic so that it can use the same logic in all of the scenarios, but it's really functionally no different. Including if all of the health checks are unhealthy, then it will put all of its records in rather than putting nothing in. So that's scenario 1. The next most similar then is OCM, because because OCM is, initially I didn't think that it was, but actually because OCM, the hub is running in one cluster, and so it's only got the one gateway that IP addresses are coming from to go to the DNS. It's actually quite a similar setup. It's just a Kuadrant gateway rather than an Istio gateway is like functionally the difference. But these IP addresses that are listed on the Kuadrant gateway, that will be all of the IP addresses of all of the spoke clusters that hub is connected to, which is sort of referenced down here. But functionally, the logic that's happening inside the hub is very similar to a single cluster, with the health checks also existing in the hub. I suppose the difference there is that the health checks are calling out to the spokes rather than back to its own endpoints, which I guess is a small difference. But functionally speaking, and from a coding perspective, it's extremely similar. So then the third scenario is multiple clusters without OCM. So in this scenario, inside the one cluster, again, this all sort of looks the same, with the controller creating health checks for its own IP addresses and using those as a gate to decide whether or not it should put its own IP addresses into the DNS record. But then, Guy, to get to the point that you just brought up, then something that I think is quite interesting to consider in this scenario is that with controllers running across multiple clusters, it gives us a much more robust health check network that we can leverage, where each cluster can look in the DNS record that is pulled down from Route 53 and see all of the IP addresses for each host name that aren't its own IP addresses, and create health checks for all of those. And then each cluster can be pinging all of the other clusters to see if their endpoints are up or not. If an endpoint is spotted that's unhealthy, then at the moment where my mind is going with that is to add a text record to the zone with some metadata saying, from cluster 1, I think this endpoint on cluster 2 is unhealthy. And then there can be like a consensus once it reaches a certain percentage of total clusters that endpoint can be removed from the DNS record by another cluster, rather than with the assumption that the cluster that IP address was added by has somehow been taken out of action without being able to clean up after itself. Craig?
Yeah, so one thing to take into consideration here is these clusters could be in different networks, so they may not be able to reach each other. So that might be something we need to consider exposing via the DNS health check. Because if you're in 3 different networks, then they're all going to fail to reach each other. And depending on the percentage you've set, they might all just then remove them. And like, oh well, they're all unhealthy, right? But that's a possibility. So
that's an interesting use case to think about. Yeah, I mean, at the worst case scenario, you could just say, well, with a particular field, every cluster only runs its own health checks and doesn't do the sort of cross network health checks. But maybe there could be some sort of identifier to say, or you can also check anything with this identifier or something like that. Or maybe like a range of IPs or something.
Yeah, I think it's something to cover under the health checks in the RFC, is like what options might be the options if the network is set up in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Yeah. Pisa?
Yeah, in the multi-cluster we found OCM. How is the status reported back to the user? Does user know that the second cluster, that it found second cluster and that it's now weighted or whatever?
Do you mean, how does the user know that 2 clusters have put their IP addresses into the zone?
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose metrics could be exposed to sort of reveal that information in like a centralized way. Obviously, they can go and look at the zone file and see what IP addresses are in there as well.
Well, the problem
it could just be in status as well, right? Like
yeah, that's what I wanted to propose. Yeah,
you're going to do a get. You're going to see that there's stuff that you don't own, so you can see how many other clusters there are, and you can just put that into status.
Yeah, basically, Yeah, because each cluster is responsible for itself, which means that when I add the second one, I expect that there will be some changes, right? That I noticed that something else got added, right? And now it's no longer doing single cluster job, but multi-cluster job. So I know that I have wrong configuration, or the configuration is working without going to AVS.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so each cluster, once it's done a pull from the Route 53 API, it can discern, I suppose, with questionable accuracy, all of the clusters that are injecting values into that zone file. Sorry, and so yeah, then it can put all of that information that it's sort of guessed into a status to say, this is what I think the overview of the set of clusters looks like from my perspective. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about actually as well. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, that's the end of it. If there's no more questions, I'm happy to give up the screen.
I do have a couple more. This diagram's cool, and it should definitely make part of the RFC. You need to export it into Miro though, because Lucid is going away.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, so one other thought I had was, like, you could have many sets of clusters. They may be sharing a zone. So you might want some kind of prefix for your records that is shared to say this set of clusters or this set of controllers is part of this set or this group.
Yeah, like a group ID or something similar to the cluster ID. Yeah.
Yeah, that you would prefix, and that would allow you to not only like not have to maybe, it would certainly help with finding which records you needed to be dealing with within that zone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's one piece. And then the other thing was rate limiting by the cloud provider. So I know what the answer to this is, but I was wanting you to maybe go into that.
Yeah, okay. So for Route 53 is all I've looked into detail for their API rate limits. And for a GET request on Route 53, a list request, the limit is 1,500 list requests per minute, which is quite high. The only way that could, in my mind, realistically be hit is, well, obviously if you have an absolutely enormous number of clusters, then you could potentially hit it. But other than that, you can only get 300 records at a time as well. So each page list request would add to that. So if you had a particularly busy managed zone, then that could prove somewhat problematic. But even so, with 1,500 per minute, if we only had this refresh like once every 10 minutes or so, then I don't see that being a huge problem.
So that raises some other interesting questions. Not particularly problems, just more like decisions to be made. One is, I wonder if the endpoint can use some kind of filter so that if you only have a limit of 300 records, maybe that prefix again can be used to filter, like, just bring me back this record set within this zone.
Yeah, I would also think in terms of mitigating that damage, having the GET request come infrequently, and if you hit the rate limit, then delay by like a random number of minutes so that the different clusters are doing their GET requests not all at the same time.
Yeah, so there's a interesting thing there, I suppose, is do you want to do it like infrequently, or do you want to do it like based on the TTL?
Yeah, the TTL probably makes sense. Yeah, that would mean they're all doing it once a minute, though. Actually. Yeah,
but it's like you said, 1,500 a minute. That's a lot of clusters, right? And if you've got that many clusters, maybe you should be using ACM, right?
Yeah.
Like there can be known limitations within a particular architecture, and that, you know, we can scale to this point is a known limitation, which if you can't work within that, then use this other architecture, right? That's everything I've got right now. It's really cool though. Good workflow. Yeah, we need an RFC. I think you're working on that, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna put that together now. Yeah.
All right. I guess we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so next on the list is Rachel.
Sure. So before Christmas, the release for HCG, there was a lot of talk about kind of testing and or a few discussions about it. And I know we talked about it during the face-to-face, but I don't think we have anything physically written down in a document or that kind of stuff. So I suppose it's just maybe out of this call, we decide to discuss this in a similar call like Alex is doing with the boards and stuff. Or we can discuss it now. I don't know how long it might take, but it's kind of one of the things that was mentioned is that anything public facing should require testing before it goes out. So in my opinion, and I think a few other people's opinions when we were discussing it, is that that shouldn't be the case, and that we can maybe we're doing too much testing for something that's upstream. And kind of that's the gist of it. Peter, you want to go first?
Yeah. So first, I will address the document thing. You are correct. We don't have it written, and it's wrong. We will remedy it. We will write something called test strategy, which we should all agree, and that should kind of list things we do, how we do it, and what that means. What we test, when we test, how we test it, what is the result, and stuff like that. Which should basically make it more transparent for all of you to see why we do it, what we do, and stuff like that. So that's first thing. Second thing is why we are so keen on not having anything released before we test it. Well, the reason is first, we will test releases, right? That's part of our job. And we will test them regardless of everything else. Second point is the easier spot a bug, it's cheaper to fix. Right? The easiest to fix a bug is, of course, when you find it when you are developing it. The most difficult to fix a bug or more costly to fix a bug or issue is when you actually have it released. The more and more you go in the process, the more actions you have to take to actually fix the issue that's there. And the issue we were having is we were in the middle of our release testing, and yeah, the release was basically published. If it's published, then it means anyone can download it and anyone can use it. Right now, it's not a big of a deal. We don't have many users who are using it, right? But regardless of the upstream, the big community it can be customers when product does version. It can be users for the upstream project. They might download it before and find the issue that wasn't caught only because it was released before we finished our testing, which makes it much more expensive to fix that issue than if you waited just a bit. You are correct. We don't need to do, or we actually do not do, according to QE standards, that much testing for release. At least in our eyes, of course, that's different that seems different for you. That's why we wanted to basically make the time in which we test things the most crucial part. Because you are correct that it's not worth it to do 2 weeks of testing for an upstream project. So that's why we want to keep it short in like 2-3 days. However, we feel that it's fair to wait 2-3 days for us to finish the testing so we can report all the issues and we can decide what to do with those issues before we have some pressure for us because somebody might be using it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I I think it's more just what you were saying about the. I totally agree with that. We need testing for releases and that kind of stuff. But when you said anything public facing like docs or blogs and that kind of stuff, like how, so every time we have to write documents or you write those kind of things, how you want to do testing around those times?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we want to do the testing. We want to be part of it. However, for those kind of stuff, we won't be blocking it, if you understand, right? We want to be part of it. We want to collaborate on it. We want to give you suggestions. However, we will not be necessarily blocking you from putting it out. If it's not a release. For release, we have a little bit stricter things, right? For blog posts or anything regarding that, we want to look at it 100%. We don't want to block you from doing it. However, if we are looking at it again, if we take reasonable amount of time, I think it's fair if you wait.
Hey, Peter, where is the time spent, the 2 to 3 days? Like, is that manual testing?
No. Most of the time is, well, at least for the past releases from the experience, is every time there is a new release, we have to discover a new feature. The feature that has not yet been fully done before that, or we didn't have access to it from various reasons.
Okay.
Some of it were our mistakes that we are slow. Some of it is that it's not properly productized or there were bugs in it. We didn't have it in nightlies. The nightlies weren't built, that kind of errors. So part of it is discovering new things. That was, for example, the single cluster DNS policy we didn't do before that the last release, right?
Mm-hmm.
Second part is we test all of the configurations, which means we manage the clusters for it, right? We have one single cluster when we run all of our automated tests. We have the multi-cluster automated tests. And the third part where the actually most time is spent is investigating false errors.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So, like, there's in my head, then there's some clear ways that we can collaborate to reduce some of that. We're not going to reduce all of it, right? Like the infrastructure is the infrastructure. If we can get a bigger budget so you can have more clusters running, then we can increase the speed of testing.
Yeah, I think it's part of it is also due to our mistakes. We don't have everything set up perfectly, right? It's also on us. But yeah, we feel we can do the automated testing in 2-3 days on both single cluster and multi-cluster. And we feel like that 3 days is a reasonable amount of time for the release. However, that is up to discussion.
Yeah, like I'm wondering, like, where we want to get to is that you guys are more involved at like the epic definition and refinement phase. And then ideally the test for that epic is delivered as part of that epic or very quickly afterwards, right? So that when we get to release phase, it's not like a catch-up.
Yeah, exactly. Agree. And I think we are all working towards getting there.
Yeah.
However, I think it's just continuous process. I think we are definitely getting better at it.
Yeah.
Like,
so
all sides.
I think it's important just to keep reminding ourselves. So
yeah, exactly.
And the other piece was, and I realized that like there's only so many people in QE, right? So, but the other piece was being able to basically take the tests that are there so that we can execute them against our own PRs with every PR, which will again bring those false positives and those bugs down, right? Because we'll be incentivized to solve them. So those two things, I think,
that's actually goal for. That's actually we have it as our goal for Q1/Q2. We want to make sure our test suite runs on kind, which it currently does not. To make sure that you can actually select the subset of tests that might interest you.
Yeah.
And see if yes, you could use some subset of our tests to run it on against your PRs. Yes, we definitely want to get near that and working towards that.
Yeah, I think if we can focus on those two key things for the next quarter, like we should start to hopefully see that 2 to 3 day period come down even further? Do you know, because
I would say that 2 days is usually minimum. I would love to get it under it, but from expectations, or sorry, from experience, I haven't seen it yet anywhere. However, I agree, goal should be to get it in so we could release with, yeah, snap of a finger, without anything, without no 2 days, just someone clicks the button and
well, that's
be
the
done
thing,
with
right?
it.
We need to keep that goal in mind and keep
Yeah,
figuring out
exactly. Agree. Agree.
what is the highest return on investment to get to that point.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alex
And
has
I
had his
think,
hand up for a minute.
yeah.
I'm gonna-
Yeah, I wanted to let it go, and then because of what was just said, I'm going to come back to it. So, you know, like I think you can apply sort of test-driven development to QE, right? Which means in our case, I think, and I was about to say probably some of which it's on myself and Craig. Maybe we weren't, I don't know, communicating well enough, like the features and blah, 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 but whatever. I think we have the epics and whatever. We have the RFC process. Part of it, maybe what we should do is make sure that very early on, some work becomes visible as to what, say, the public API for a feature would be, right? So that technically, even though if the API isn't there, you should be able to implement your tests, right? And those tests can run and can fail prior to release. So back to the 2-3 days, you know, actually, I think if all goes well, you guys are at the beach enjoying a cocktail, right? And you're just watching us, mere mortal engineers, sweating like to death to have the bar become green, right? And then you do nothing. It's no rubber stamping or whatever. It just, you know, not even that. It just is greenlit because all the tests pass, right? And but back to the false negatives, I guess, is the issue we have, right? So things failing while they shouldn't, they're actually correct, right? Maybe having back again, like bridging the gap and make sure that everybody here, sorry, I'm pointing at all the beautiful faces on this meeting, you know exactly what's going to be tested, right? So back again to the TDD thing, right? The test is red right now because that's what expected as an outcome, and it's a thing we have all agreed on. And obviously we'll make mistakes, and sometimes it's not going to be what we all had hoped for, and then discussion happens again, right? But so I think it's feasible. And back to the point, yes, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, maybe you don't want a cocktail, you just want a beer, but I'm pretty sure you at the beach is a pretty picture, right? And that's how we do releases. So anyways, so I think it's feasible. And back to what you said, when I think we should aim for what's feasible. And if it means like another few months, years, centuries, or whatever, how long it takes to get there, that's a different question. But, you know, aiming for that thing. And I think, as you said, I think we're becoming better at this. But yeah, long way to go. So I think we can achieve that. And then back to, I think, what Rachel was trying to highlight, right? That brings it down to sort of zero, right? We sort of all converge to, oh yeah, now the work's done, and release.
Yeah, I agree. 100% we should aim for it. Yeah, only just for the at least few another releases, I would say that 2-3 days testing period is reasonable and should cover everything. And of course, yeah, but the aim is to reduce it as much as possible, eliminate it completely. One more thing I will mention regarding the epics. We have RFCs. What I'm sometimes missing is when the RFC is done. For example, if I look at single policy RFC, I already...
Sorry, do you mean implemented or?
Yeah, fully done. If I currently look at the single cluster DNS policy RFC, there are a bunch of things that are still not implemented. However, yeah, it's now remedied. I talked with Craig, and the epic is reopened. However, it was closed even though the DNS policy wasn't fully implemented, or the RFC isn't implemented. I would say the notifications regards, yes, with this release, these two RFC should be fully compliant, right? Or just somewhere saying this is now fully compliant or whatever. If it's reliable, that should be awesome.
It's a bit of an ongoing process, I think, because like there's things in the RFC that are optional and not like required, as you can see, because DNS policy in some cluster works without them. And it's like, how do we handle things that are like optional versus required? Yeah.
Is this tying back into this discussion we had, Craig, like of an epic not necessarily fitting like a release and or sprint? Yeah, okay, I see where we're coming from. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know really what the right way to solve it is yet. Like I reopened it, but in reality, I'd like to close it because DNS policy is in a single cluster. It is working, and have a second epic that is like, here's a set of enhancements to DNS in a single cluster, DNS policy in a single cluster, right? So it's a little bit tricky.
That specific one, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I finished.
Yeah, regarding that specific one, I feel like, yeah, we could have two epics and have both of them linked to the RFC. That's fine, right?
Yeah.
In this particular case, I would also say I do not require any actions right now to remedy it, right? I believe we are all on the right path. I think we are getting better at it in general processes, planning, and everything. But yeah, it's still an issue. I think it will be remedied by
it's an issue.
Accident, while solving all the other issues we currently face. So I don't need any more actions.
Yeah, it's an issue that I've faced like throughout history, right? Because you go to Jira, you create an epic, it becomes a bucket, a whole bunch of stuff. Like features go out, they're released, and there's still stuff open in the epic because there's still these optional and these like little things that maybe we'll do at some point, right? It's a little bit tricky. Like, when do you close that epic, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, I've seen different strategies. One has been like milestone 1, milestone 2, milestone 3, right? Different epics for each, and stuff just moves from one bucket to the next bucket, right? So it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. I'm not sure what the optimal solution is here.
Okay, I'm gonna bring it back because I think we went a little off track from what was Rachel trying to do at the beginning. So, Rachel, I have a specific question for you. Does my answer satisfy you? Is it enough? Do you now understand why we do what we do, or why we do? Are so keen on the releases?
No, I understood from the beginning why we do what we do. It's more the smaller nuances of each scenario that we should do testing on. Like in my opinion, if we do too much testing, we're essentially giving away a productized version for free, because that's essentially what a customer pays for. So it's like a fine line between having testing. And I think that's where the discussion came into place, that we have a lot of the testing being done during the PR stage, so there's not a lot of testing that has to be done afterwards on your part, and that allows us then to be more agile and speedy and that kind of stuff. So no, I totally get what you're saying now, and I think maybe I don't know if we can assign, like, if we create an epic for a shared goals between you guys and us, and we can like hold each other accountable for things, because I know sometimes we have the best intentions and we say we're going to do stuff, but it kind of falls to the wayside. So that might be something to do as well.
How about the strategy? I think everything we do and how we do it is best discussed there, because there you can tell us that this is too much, it's not needed. Also, feel free to shout at me that it's not done or I haven't shared anything. It might happen. But I would say this is task for us to create something, to create the strategy, and then for you to review and accept it or give us suggestions. Alex?
Yeah, there's one thing with which I don't agree, though. All the stuff that's been tested so far are Kuadrant release, which is an upstream thing. It has nothing to do with downstream. Well, nothing. It's unmapped to anything downstream as of today, anyways.
Yes.
So I don't think we're like. Anyways, I personally don't agree with the statement that what we do downstream is just testing the stuff that we do upstream. I actually very much disagree with that statement. And
I also, yeah.
and the one thing that I would like to keep, though, is that what we do is we do the best to put out upstream what is an upstream release, right? The day that we start sneaking downstream concerns into the upstream releasing thing, then yes, then I think we have many problems, actually. But yeah, so I don't think what we do is that, and I don't think that's the proper way of looking at it. Anyway, certainly not my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree that the strategy is primarily also for the upstream. It's just agreement between. It also can be an RFC for if you want to do it fully upstream, right? It's completely fine. It's just an agreement to what we actually do, and so we are all on the same page.
Cool. I think that sounds good.
And just in time too. So, Alex, we're gonna have to shift yours, I think, to next week.
Yeah, no worries. It was just in case we had time.
All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.